Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first local lens hosted by the Federation of Community Councils. My name's Ariana. I'm the executive director. And before we get started, I did just want to share some kind of group agreements for this space so we're all on the same page. Local Lens, our sessions are a space for learning and conversation among members of community councils and the public. The goal of the sessions is to dive deep into various government structures within the municipality. In this space, we're all going to agree to treat each other with respect, to recognize our neighborhood's unique viewpoints of their residents, and to allow everyone a chance to participate before taking follow-ups or additional questions. Some Zoom logistics, please stay muted unless you're called on to ask a question. If you do have a question, just stick a message in the chat and then we'll go in order. Stay on topic as much as possible. Try to keep your questions brief and to the point, and consider the time. We may need to be mindful of time constraints since we do only want this to be an hour, but we want everybody to be able to ask their questions. So I may have to politely cut people off so that we can keep asking questions and moving along. I do encourage everybody, if you have questions at the end that we don't get to, or you have more in-depth conversations, our presenters' information will be provided in the chat and available in the YouTube link, so you can always reach out to him afterwards and follow up with more questions. I'm sure they would love to talk with you more. And then also, we invite you as community council members to continue the conversation in your community council, invite them to present there, or just bring the topic to your community council and see what's going on. Okay. So I would like to introduce our presenter today. We have Daniel McKenna-Foster from the Department of Planning from the municipality. Daniel, thank you. Thanks for coming and joining us for this session.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking zoning and special limitations. I just wanted to start everyone off on the same page because I know, at least for me, this was a new topic. What are special limitations? Can you give us a little debrief, like some history?
Yeah, so some of you in the audience might be familiar with them, but I guess it starts with zoning codes and the zoning map, and basically all of Anchorage is divided into zones that show where you can do different types of things with your land. Some areas are mostly residential, some are mostly commercial, some are industrial, some are mixed. In general, the system proceeds that there's a number of zones, about 15 zones, and generally with each zone, you have an idea of what is or isn't allowed there. So special limitations are a new set of limitations on top of a zone that can change a wide variety of the aspects of the zone. They can change what's allowed there. They can change dimensional standards for the buildings built in there. They can prohibit uses. They can include uses. So they allow a kind of another bigger set of regulation on top of the existing zoning structure. And so they're created through the process, and they have to be sort of approved by the assembly, and they can only be removed or changed by a rezone.
Okay, and so what have we always had special limitations? When did that start?
So as far as I can go back, I think we've had special limitations since the beginning of the municipality of Anchorage. They might have been to some extent in the borough, the greater Anchorage area borough, which kind of got absorbed in the late 1970s. But we do still have special limitations on the books from the late 1970s. So they've always been around. And it's interesting. And in our research, we found that a lot of, as the municipality is sort of dealing with incorporating the former city of Anchorage and the borough of Anchorage, and melding those two codes together, it looks in many cases like special limitations were used to cover places where the code wasn't enough. A lot of stuff about environmental protections, a lot of stuff about sort of site plans and other reviews that hadn't been incorporated into the code yet, because the code was pretty simple and concise back then. And then, so if you look at a chart of SLs over time, the most are in the 80s when everybody's kind of dealing with, the new anchorage and what's going on. And then they're slowly declined in use over time. But at another presentation, somebody asked, well, maybe is that related to decline in use or just decline in building? And that's a great question. I haven't done a regression or something. I don't even know what you would do. But, yeah, so they've been a part of Anchorage for a while. They were used more in the 80s, and they're used less and less over time. But the thing
And do
is that
they?
it lasts as long as it's there. It lasts basically until it's removed.
Oh, got it. Okay, so they're forever once they're on the books as of
Yeah.
right now.
Unless there's a special, it says this exists until it expires or until a certain thing is done. But
Got
yeah,
it.
it's permanent.
Okay, and do they fall into categories at all, or do we know how many there are? Is it really popular?
There are probably between 300 and 400 zoning districts that have extra special limitations on top of them. And you're probably wondering why don't you know the exact answer? It's hard to categorize them because the way we count them is by looking at the ordinances. So an SL is passed by ordinance, but some ordinance will cover multiple areas or multiple districts. So it'll say this ordinance now creates a B3 SL, an R3 SL, and an RO SL. So is that three SLs because it really is three zoning districts, or is it one SL that applies to, and I don't think we've
Mm.
fully come down on that yet, but there are about 300 to 400 AOs, assembly ordinances, that deal with SLs. The other thing too is sometimes in the records there's an SL that's created and then it's removed by another AO. So our best numbers come from looking at the most current map, which is really the only source to find these AOs, and sort of counting those. But again, some they're not listed, or you have to dig and find them, or they're in paper copy. So there are a lot out there, and they're spread all over the municipality.
And who suggests the SLs? Anybody can do a
I,
suggestion or
they can come up through a rezoning process. So a rezone is a public process. It requires certain notification. So at any point in that process, there are a variety number of actors who can propose them. Ultimately, only assembly can choose to include them in a rezone or not. And recently, we've even seen the assembly removing SLs from a rezone, and then approving the rezone without them. But looking back through the records, you can see that sometimes somebody will apply for a rezone, and in the original application, it's just an application to say, I'd like to go from R3 to B3. But then when
mm,
it gets to planning and zoning, now the application says R3 to B3 SL. And so, in some cases, the applicant is suggesting it, maybe to get it across the finish line, maybe the Planning and Zoning Commission, maybe the municipality, maybe the assembly. So they can come from a number of places, but most important is the assembly decides whether they want to pass the rezone with the SL or not.
got it. And the reason this is relevant right now is because of AO 2024-99, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about that AO, the history of it, where we are in the process now?
Yeah, so the assembly introduced AO 2024-99, which says that basically let's not do any more SLs moving forward. And then if it passes, it would direct the planning department to look into all the existing SLs and sort of investigate and see if they're still needed or not. So the assembly waived planning and zoning commission review. But the planning department has kind of gone through the process where we created a case, we brought it to planning and zoning, we went to them twice, on November 18th and then December 9th. And we've produced some staff reports, we've done a lot of research on it, and then it's going back to the assembly tomorrow, December 17th. So anybody who wants to comment before the assembly, that would be the time to do it. So I think the assembly lays out their sort of explanation, I think, pretty well in the AO and the memo. But there's mention of it makes things complicated. There are a lot of SLs that limit housing, explicitly limiting housing, and there are a variety of other issues. But this originated with the assembly, and the planning department's role has really been to sort of provide some information, look into it more, and it's been great for us too, because in doing this process, we're going to make sure that many of they're easier to find. But just embarking on that journey, it's taken a lot of work and a lot of
Yeah,
investigation.
that makes sense. Before I open it to the floor, is there anything else you wanted to add to kind of ground us in the history and the background of special limitations?
Yeah, I think it's just, I think I've read through every SL in Anchorage at this point, and it's pretty amazing how varied they are. And they're pretty complicated. So of course for planners they're complicated to use because if somebody calls, they're expecting that, B3 or R3 is going to be consistent everywhere they go. But then there's this extra set of rules, and you can't find it usually without calling the planning department. So there's some issues with that with people being able to find it. Some of them aren't listed. Some of them refer to zones that don't exist. I found a B4 SL today. The B4 zoning district doesn't exist anymore. It's a piece of old
Mm.
code. Some refer to really kind of complicated measurements. There's one that says, no, nothing on this property can be higher than the tallest structure. So just from the sort of implementation point of view, what happened if the structure falls down? Does that mean that nothing then could be built again? So it's just a lot of stuff like that. There's some transparency issues, but also as we've gone through this process, we've seen it's been a very useful tool, right? And for policymakers it's served an important purpose in sort of managing pressure when there's pressure to approve something but also pressure to deny something. SLs have sort of served as that tool. And it's a very powerful tool because it is so broad and you could do so many things with it. You can basically take a B3 zone, which is a really flexible zone that allows a lot of flexibility in dimension and uses, and turn it into an R1 zone, even though it's still called B3. Some zones will say you can only build a single family in here. It's an R3 and it says you can only build single family, and which is reducing a lot of the zones. So it's a really powerful tool. And looking at it, it's a very Anchorage story that Anchorage was struggling with developing regulations as regulations got strengthened and a little more kind of fit with what was needed over time. You see the tool being used less.
Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that background. I open it to the floor if anybody has questions about the AO or special limitations. Oh, this is going to be a short one. John, I see you come off mute.
Sorry, I'm doing this on my phone. I'm not used to doing Zoom on my phone. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, Daniel, thanks for that. I really look forward to your report on all the variety of SLs that are out there historically. It's got to be pretty amazing. But it's surprising to me that the assembly would choose to get rid of a tool that is actually, um, very. It has a lot of benefits, and it it seems like the impression that the SLs are viewed as limiting use of property when they actually open up the ability to use property. And examples are, I guess many, it's probably typical where someone comes in, the process is request a rezone, typically so they can do something more on their property. And there are times, and this is in the code, where if it doesn't really match the new code, then you would deny the rezone. But if you just say, well, if we could rezone it, but if you do these little things or don't do these things with special limitations, then we'll allow it to be upzoned. So the person doing the zoning now has a choice. Are these FLs too burdensome? I'm going to leave it like it is. Or do I accept the rezone with these FLs and I've benefited from it? And that's typically the case. Um, I've been involved when I was on planning commission with many, and then of course on the assembly as well. So we've got um, some examples that jump out. And Daniel, I may be wrong on this, but when they rezoned the um, old archives or the proposed archive site, and I think there was an SL that said, but you have to protect the possible daylighting of Fish Creek. So that's an SL that said, okay, well, we want to do this, but there's really no other clear tool besides a replat to protect that use from the creek. There's another one, and that fellow came back and forth with several times. But he had a property that was zoned residential, but it was right, I think, on Scooter, and he wanted to put in self-storage. And the assembly said, well, that's a little much to move it to B3 and lose all that residential. So there was a special limitation saying, okay, we'll do the rezone, but you have to protect at least half of it for residential. So what these do is they actually open up more use of these properties. If you look at it in that direction, I think the assembly's looking at it from the other direction and says, well, wait a minute, we've got this B3, but it has this limitation on it, and we don't want to limit them. But the truth is, it may have been a less intense zoning prior to the rezone, even with the limitation. So, you know, if they get rid of that tool, I think they'll regret it. They're going to get a rezone, a requested
Hey,
rezone that only works for that. So that's done. That's my last
hey,
one.
yeah, John, I was like, do you have a question in there?
Well, I'd like Daniel's feedback on that, because I think not from a less intense use becoming more intense along with the SL. They're looking and just saying, oh, this SL creates a barrier, but it actually, the SL created the ability to use that property. So I'd appreciate Daniel's comment on that.
Yeah, you bring up, I think you identified a lot of the ways it's been used. I think, and we state this in the staff report, that, sometimes it's appropriate to deny a rezone. If a rezone truly isn't appropriate and it might open up uses that aren't appropriate for that area, then maybe that also suggests that maybe there's a problem with the code, right? And we've seen that too, where if we keep coming up against, we don't want this in B3 because it's a gas station use, and gas station's a permitted use. That might be like, well, maybe then the problem is having gas stations a permitted use. Maybe it should be a conditional use. And that is a way that you apply that sort of oversight and you maintain the tool, but without limiting the entire opening up B3. And in terms of the archives property, that actually doesn't have an SL. So that was rezoned to R4A, and I think they did it through an effective clause. And I'm glad you brought that up, because people ask, well, what are other tools to do this? Deed restrictions, covenants, effective clauses, or sometimes, maybe change the code or change the plan, right? Like if we're seeing a bunch of rezones and people are saying these aren't appropriate, then maybe the plan shouldn't have those areas, be eligible to rezone into those zones. Or if we see a bunch of rezones and they're getting approved, even though the plan says they shouldn't be, then maybe the plan hasn't allocated space correctly, right? Like we've seen that in some places where we say this is going to be low density residential, but it keeps getting rezoned and the plan keeps getting changed. That might be a bigger issue of, maybe on the plan, we didn't quite get this right on this one. So it's tricky, because if you're allowing something that might not be appropriate, but you're allowing it with these special conditions, you're almost you might be subverting the plan or subverting the code in a way. And people are expecting sort of standardization to say, well, I don't want that type of use. And then you run the risk of, if you're allowing it in certain cases, then other people don't get the same protection, right? So say there's something in B3 that's really unpalatable for people, and one area has the wherewithal to say, we want an SL against this particular use, but another area might have the same issues with that use. By putting an SL on, you lose the opportunity to say, wait a second, maybe we should pause. Maybe we shouldn't approve this rezone. Let's look at B3, and maybe there are a couple of uses in there that we can tweak it so that's a conditional use now. So then you still have those protections. So if somebody says, we don't want that in our neighborhood, you say, we understand this is supposed to be a commercial area, but we totally understand you're worried about impacts. The conditional use process is there. And through conditional use process, then you can apply specific conditions to that use. And they're to that use or to that situation rather than to the zone overall. And so you maintain the consistency of the zoning code, but also allow those protections. So I'm glad you brought that up, because people ask, well, what other tools are there? And there are a lot. Deed restrictions, especially if you own the property. But the archives site is a great example, because they did. I think they put something on the condition. It might be an effective clause or a conditional of approval or something that says, when this is platted, you need to put in the daylighting of Fish Creek. And I know that property in particular, they thought about doing B3SL there for years. And then they said, finally, they created the R4A zone basically to do all that stuff. So the R4A zone is pretty much a standardized B3SL, because it has a minimum density of 20 dwellings per acre and has all the uses that the flexibility of mixed use of B3, but none of the uses that people don't like about B3, like some of the, car dealers, mini storage, that sort of thing. So.
I don't want
Thanks.
to that list question, but you can go through your.
Yeah. Let me see if anyone else has a question, and we can come back. Anyone else? Yeah, Steve Montooth.
Yeah, Daniel, what do you call it when I don't know if it's a zoning thing or not, but when people want to build another residence on the same lot, what is that called? It's an additional residential unit.
Oh, like an accessory dwelling unit?
Yeah, I guess that's what you call it. And does a resident, an R1 or R3, what has to change for that to happen?
To allow an accessory dwelling unit to be built?
Yeah.
Well, currently the code allows accessory dwelling units in R1 and R3. It, there could be an SL that says they're explicitly not allowed. In fact, I can think of one I've seen where it says accessory dwellings aren't permitted, but there are also places across the bowl that they have deed restrictions or covenants that they say you can't build an accessory dwelling unit, which again, the zoning doesn't touch that. It doesn't infringe upon that. But currently you are allowed and you are permitted to build an accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah, Dave.
Awesome. Daniel, thanks for presenting here today. I really appreciate it. I am a complete zoning rookie, so just don't mind my dumb questions. But you mentioned conditional use, and I just have a question about that. You said it can basically expand the limitations, if you will, of the zone. Is that correct? Two, when that conditional use is put on, is it just for like the duration of the building use until it's not used as like a gas station anymore? Or like when is the conditional use up?
There are no bad questions in zoning, and anybody who's interested, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Yeah, so it's kind of like maybe it's like no, that's not a good analogy. I can't think of a great analogy but a conditional use, if you look at the use table, I don't know how much you've looked at zoning, but if you go to chapter 5, it says all the uses. And so you look at your zone and it said, this is permitted if you go through an extra process, and this is permitted if you go to planning and zoning and they can apply some conditions to it. So say let's just make one up, that you're in an R1 zone and like veterinary services is a conditional use. And you're like, I really want to open up veterinary services here. So to do that, you go through the application, you have to go to Planning and Zoning Commission, and you'd have to figure out like, well, is this going to work or not? And they'd look at your property, they look at the setbacks and this and that. And they might say, we think this is okay if you make sure that you have the dog yard or whatever on this side of the building, and that you only operate between these hours. And then they can impose that on that specific use. And so as long as you're doing that use, that's in effect. And if you don't do that, then you can't do it. You can just go back to having a single family home. So say you do your veterinary practice or whatever you're doing there for 10 years, and you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go back to being a single family house. That's permitted. So then once you remove that use, you're back to the regular use table. And you could do any of the other uses as well. So it's sort of contained within. And to do that use, you're subject to the conditions that the Planning and Zoning Commission approves. Once you go back to a different use, if it's a permitted use, then you're back to it. If you went to another conditional use, you'd have to go through another one. So you're like, the veterinary service thing isn't working. I want to do a doctor's office. They're like, okay, well, then you need to make sure that any venting goes out on this side, and you can only have deliveries only on this side, and you're bound to those specifically. The difference between doing that as a conditional use versus a special limitation is a special limitation would put that on the entire property forever, no matter what, to just say like, you can only do this and this and this, versus the conditional use process does it use by use. So you still have within the container of that zoning allowances. I think that answered your question. Let me know if it didn't.
Yeah, that helps. So in the veterinarian's case, like the veterinarian, they want to sell their business, but they sell it to another veterinarian. The conditional use still applies because, it's being used the same. So it can continue in perpetuity as long as it's used the same way it is.
Exactly. But say they violate and they're like, oh, I'm going to put the dog yard on this side. Then the city would say, no, this use is only allowed under the conditions which we stipulated. And so you have to do it that way. And so then they could take it away or they could enforce against it.
Right.
I have a question. If there's a lot of conversation in housing about process and trying to make things easier to increase housing, is there a cost and or time difference between doing a special limitation versus a conditional use?
So they're kind of different because they're they're sort of imposed differently and they function differently. And there aren't many instances where, actually, here's an example. There aren't many mobile home parks as an allowed use in Anchorage. Where they are allowed, they're allowed as a conditional use. So maybe R3, I think it allows a mobile home park as a conditional use. So you can, if say I have a big lot and I'm like, oh, I have 5 acres, I want to do it. I go through the whole process and they look at it and they say, you can only have this many trailers in this street, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a path to getting to building that mobile home park. But if my lot has a special limitation that says mobile home parks are not allowed, and there is one like that, I think it's at O'Malley and Lake Otis, it's an R3 lot, and it says explicitly you can't have mobile home parks here. I just cannot build a mobile home park on that lot. Whereas if it was another R3 lot, I could do it through that conditional use process. Now, if I wanted to change that, I have to go through the full rezone process. So I have to go to planning and zoning and then go to the assembly, in my case, to say, I'd like to get this SL removed just so this R3 SL lot can become like another R3 SL lot, or R3 lot, excuse me. And then I could go through the conditional use process to try to build a mobile home park. But in general, most housing is not a conditional use. It's usually a permitted use or just not an allowed use. But through SLs, there are a lot of limitations on density, or in some cases, even certain types of housing.
Thanks. Anybody else have a question? John or Dave, you're welcome to come back with a second one. We got a small team.
Yeah, Ariana, this is Michael Malvik. I'm representing or here on behalf of Rabbit Creek Community Council.
Yeah. Hi, Michael.
Actually, I realized I'm being antisocial. Let me see if I can get the camera to work, but
No
without
worries.
stalling things. One thing that came out in the meeting back on December 5th was there was a graphic shown that there have only been 9 special limitations in the 2020s, and in the 2010s it was 38, and back in the 1980s it was 131. And this isn't it was acknowledged this isn't a complete data set because there's 80 to 100 that are unknown because they're still just in paper copies and haven't been added to the GIS layers, and Daniel can set me straight on that. But anyway, it looks like, and even Daniel touched on it, how this special limitation application has been trailing off, and granted, we're only halfway through the 2020s. So if you double the 9, that gets us 18, which is still only half the times it was applied in the 2010s. So to get to the question is allowing special limitations to continue to be a mechanism, or to prohibit them from being a mechanism, is that, to John Weddleton's point, is that a piece of flexibility that your department would really like to give up, or that the assembly wants to give up because it's not being used very much anymore because the code has progressed to the point where, with conditional uses and whatnot, the special limitation card doesn't have to be played?
Thanks for the question. You hit everything, and you must have watched the CEDC meeting because it's like you had the chart in front of you.
Yes.
So, I can't speak to the assembly's use of the tool or their ideas of using or not using the tool. But you're right, they do seem to be declining, and that seems to track with the code getting better at responding to problems or issues within the code. I think as we've looked at it in the department, it's kind of like a lot of these issues should be dealt with in the code, or they should be dealt with in other ways. Maybe they should be a deed restriction. So in our experience, they're pretty difficult to implement. They're difficult to use. They're difficult to find. They're hard for the public. And we don't use that. They're being used less and less. So I guess for us, we'd say it would be a good opportunity to make the code even better and more responsive, and maybe push us to, if there are things where people are saying, I'm okay with the zone, but I want a special limitation. I think we would immediately say, well, what's wrong with the zone? How can we fix that for you? because fixing it for you means we're fixing it for everybody. As for the assembly, I don't know how they add to or limit their power is their own question. But they also instructed us to look at whether some of the ones that exist should be removed or not. And that would be a whole nother process in 2025. But part of our research has been looking at, and we asked the Geotechnical Advisory Commission and said, if these were gone in hypothetical, do you feel that the codes we have today would be safe enough to meet those standards? And they were also very cautious. They said, we wouldn't say get rid of them right now or anything, but they said our building codes now are good, and they weren't in the 80s, right? They didn't really cover slope and that sort of thing very well. So I think from our perspective in the planning department, looking at it, we see this as, it's a tool. It seems like it's been a tool that's been more useful for other parties, maybe planning, zoning, or the assembly. But for us, I think it would encourage us to make the code even better and have the code respond to needs on a consistent basis, rather than have everybody stuck with the unfortunate. And I don't think anybody wants to be in that situation of trying to solve a problem on the dais or at the meeting. For us, I think we prefer the transparency and consistency where everything's clear going into it. And so everything is like a little bit more even across the board and evenly applied.
So what's the process for changing the code? Is it as agile as an SL, which requires an AO? So is it easier to make the code more applicable or more flexible? Not flexible, but more comprehensive, so it is more responsive?
That's a great question. So to change the code, you have to go through the full process also, and it has to be approved by the assembly. The difference is at the end of it, those changes apply everywhere. I think a good example is the discussion a few years ago of allowing, I think it was homeless shelters in B3. You might remember that was pretty contentious, a lot of feeling back and forth. But if that's an issue that's coming up in many different places, it does seem appropriate to have that discussion for all of B3, right? Rather than just letting that coming up every time there's one instance of a rezone to B3. So I think changing the code can be a long process or a short process, but what it does is it's a uniform process. And then people can really decide, is this use appropriate in B3 or not? Or is this use appropriate in R3 or not? And same with if you were changing the land use plan as well. Is it really appropriate that R3 could be an implementing zone here? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But by doing that and establishing at that level, you prevent anybody from going through and having to sort of roll the dice and say, well, I hope I can get B3 and I hope I get all the uses in it, but I don't know what the endpoint will be. So I would say it's anything that goes through the assembly, it has to go through that same public process. The difference is an SL is a piece by piece, case by case, whereas a text amendment to the use table, for example, applies broadly and evenly and consistently.
Thanks, Michael. I do want to give Steve Callahan a chance to ask his question. If you have another one, we can circle back.
Sure.
Oops. Have you noticed the pattern of where the SLs are in Anchorage? Like, are there more on the hillside, more in the bowl, more in certain areas?
It's a great question. We looked, and one of the things the Geotechnical Advisory Commission asked, because we heard that a lot of SLs are related to slope. And so we looked and we didn't see a lot of correlation between SLs and the ground seismic hazard areas. There are some in slopes. If you look up, on the hillside, there's a lot of R10 SLs. There are some in like Eagle River on sort of sloped areas, but nothing really jumps out. Again, I'm not a statistician or an analysis guy, so I don't know if you could do some regression and figure out, they tend to be in other places. They seem to be pretty widely distributed across the bowl, and they also seem at different times they're doing different things. A lot of in Midtown, a lot of it, kind of like John mentioned earlier, is stuff going from R3, because a lot of stuff was R3, it was just blanket zone R3, converting to B3, and people, they're trying not to lose residential capacity. So they're doing that. And there wasn't site plan reviews in the code at that time, I don't think. So you'll see a lot of B3 SLs in Midtown related to specific uses and site plan reviews, and sometimes preserving housing. Other places, it's more about slope, and it says, look, you have to be a certain, the lot size has to be a certain size because there are no other slope regulations. Others come before we had wetlands protections or stream protections, which came in Title 21 in 2014. A lot in Eagle River will say you have to be 50 feet away from these streams, or from this watershed or something like that. So those are the trends. I think there are more trends that you can kind of find by decade than necessarily geographic area. Except I will say, with one exception, if you look along Muldoon, there are a ton of SLs related to access, and they're related to access to Muldoon Road, which I think, because Muldoon Road is a state DOT road, and before there were processes in place for DOT to approve or disapprove for access, like driveways, it looks like they were doing that through SLs. Whereas now the code, of course, says you have to check with DOT to get access. But back then there probably wasn't. So DOT, in the process, were like, we got to control access to this. So please, on this SL limit, say you can only have one driveway on DeBar. Whereas now that just happens in the internal stuff before it gets to permit. So that, I think, is a lot. If you look at the ones on Muldoon, those do tend to have a lot of access stuff and some use stuff. But other than that, I can't say they're all concentrated in one area. Look at the zoning map. You'll see them pretty much all over the place.
Thank you. John, did you have another question?
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with this effective clause routine with using archives. It sounds like potentially it's like another kind of SL. You left that out there.
So that's something that the Planning and Zoning Commission raised, right? And in this process, we found that the code says you can approve a rezone. Well, it says different things. For the Planning and Zoning Commission can recommend a rezone with modifications or stipulations. Those terms are kind of undefined. And then for the Assembly, it says you can approve it with special limitations or an effective clause. And somewhere in there, it also says conditions of approval. So you've highlighted, like, well, so what is the difference? In our reading, a condition of approval is really something, a temporary one-time thing. It's usually something like you have to record the plat before it comes into effect. Or, you have to, sometimes it's like you have to remove a structure or something like that. And same with the effective clause. I'll look and I'll see what, I'll see if I can pull up. It'll take me a moment, but John, I'll make sure to pull up what happened in the archive site. Because I remember they were talking about doing a special limitation for that Fish Creek thing. But that also, again, that seems like something that might be the most appropriate as a deed restriction on the land, because then it can go on the plat and it is sort of geographically related. But I'm going to look right now and see what the archives, if it was an effective clause or condition of approval. But thanks to the Planning and Zoning Commission, they brought that up and they said, what is this? What are the differences here? And I think they found something in code that isn't quite clear that, well, also we need to look into.
We're gonna wait while Daniel gets his, see if he can answer it. Dave, you'll be next, and then Michael, and then we'll go back to Steve Callahan.
It'll take me a little bit, but
Okay.
I was going to follow up on what Daniel was talking about, because we had a project where we had to remove the existing structures for a replat before we built the new structure. That was the clause that came out. We had to remove all the existing structures before we could build the new structure. And that was for a platting action for a subdivision. That'd be similar to an effective clause.
But there's still some room. We need to clean that. We need to figure that out. And I think that's one of our recommendations to the Assembly. You said you should figure out what you mean by stipulations, what you mean by modifications, and what you mean by condition of approval, and what you mean by effective clauses, and define those a little better.
Right. This was a stipulation okay. From whatever planning and zoning and everybody else. Yeah.
I think he's still looking. Dave, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think it was actually partly answered. I didn't identify myself, but Dave from the Northeast Community Council, you actually spoke to my question about Muldoon Road, and interestingly enough, I'll put it in the chat, but the AO or proposed actually has the map of East Anchorage in there. Can't actually put it in there, but oh, wait, there it is. And you said there's a lot of special uses along Muldoon Road. And actually, one of the things that this speaks to is that there's actually not anything defined in the SLs for these. And I don't know what is the plan for the SLs, like if you just don't even know what it is. I guess it doesn't matter.
You mean if it's not listed on the map?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a complication for the public basically, because some are listed, but some basically you have to call us and we go up to the front of the counter where we have these huge paper maps that were printed out, probably the 90s, and we look on there and usually it is on there. But other than that, well, what will be there will be the assembly ordinance. So then we'll look at that AO number and then we'll go into the clerk's file and we'll pull the AO, and then we have to sort of interpret what that says. But one thing that will come out of this probably next year, regardless of which way it goes, will be we're going to get all the AOs listed on that map. So, I mean, it's not easy even finding an AO, right? But at least once you have the number, you can plug it in somewhere. Currently, there are a bunch. And sometimes I think because sometimes different AOs apply to the same property. There's one up by Glen Highway, and it's like a 1979 SL and like a 1990 SL, because the 1990 SL changed one part of the previous SL. It allowed another use. So I think for GIS, when they're putting it on there, they're like, we don't want to put two on here. So hopefully somebody mentioned there are 79 we haven't categorized, but that's coming eventually, and it's a priority for us, just in terms of just so people can find what it is. Because imagine you buy the property, you're like, cool, I got some R2M, but it's R2MSL, and you're like, I'm going to do my veterinary business. It says no veterinary businesses, right? Like it'd be nice to know that before you got the property, but.
Michael, you had another question, I think.
Well, actually, I'll springboard off of something Daniel just said. So the sense I'm getting about some of the issue with SLs is a lack of immediate access or transparency. Transparency is sometimes a loaded term, but it's more about the SLs are generally, or the older ones especially, maybe in a format that's not accessible yet through the GIS. So is the sense that a lot of the distaste for SLs is because they aren't immediately accessible, and so then it's a matter of, whatever time frame, 1 to 3 years. I'm not sure how long it would take to clean up the database and put everything on a GIS layer, or as you mentioned, list all the ordinances. So it sounds like that bit of housekeeping has to be done, whether the special limitations were eliminated, future special limitations were eliminated or not. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, just in terms of the information, making the information more publicly available, that should probably be done anyway, right? So everybody can find out which rules apply. And that's part of it. But I think too, if you look at the SLs, I mean, a lot of them explicitly prohibit or limit housing or other uses, or they require extra reviews on things. There was just one on Tudor Road, I think it was South Central Foundation, was they were building a greenhouse it was like an elder care facility. But the SL from the 80s or 90s says anything you do, you have to go through a public hearing, like a administrative site plan review. And so they had to spend, months. They had to hire an engineer. They had to go to planning and zoning just to do this like greenhouse. And, it was probably a well-meaning thing back in the day. People, it's the curve Pilates. People probably thought that was going to really blow up. But now they're like, we're just trying to add this little thing here. And so it seems sort of like disproportionate. So a lot of it is, that people can't find them. But then we do also hear that it makes it really complex for people to figure out just what the path forward. And then there's, of course, the housing piece that a lot of them explicitly limit or prohibit housing, which seems to be a big discussion point these days.
So in the greenhouse example, if the SL wasn't there, what would have been the process for them to be able to put a greenhouse in? Does the code already allow for greenhouses, or would they still be having to go through the zoning process?
So they would have come in and we'd look at the use table, and then we look at the accessory use table, because we say, okay, you have I think it is an elder care, or it's sort of an adult daycare. And then we'd say, is a greenhouse an allowable accessory use to this? And I think it is. I don't have the use table in front of me. But then if it was, we say, okay, so that you meet that permitted requirement. And now we go through the building permit process. So we say, you don't violate the setbacks. You don't go higher than this height. It can only be this size. And then if the building reviewers look at it and everything's cool, then you're permitted and you just go through it. So it always goes through the building code, and it always goes through the zoning code. The SLs just sometimes make you go through additional code on top of that. And again, say too many people are building greenhouses and it's getting out of control. From the planning perspective, you could say, well, then maybe we shouldn't allow greenhouses as an allowable permitted accessory use. Maybe it could be a conditional use. And then we can figure out, there are too many people being blinded by glass. We're like, okay, well, you can put up a greenhouse if you have the glass, but there'd be a way to do that through the use table rather than the zoning district, which has an SL, which says you have to go through an administrative site plan review, regardless of what it was. So they would, if you put a new like restaurant there, same process as even if you just put a greenhouse there as an accessory use.
Steve says it was a children's daycare facility not connected to the main building.
Oh, thank you,
for
Steve.
their greenhouse. I had a question, because part of this AO is to have you guys as the planning department go back through all the existing special limitations and define them and get them public and all of that. What's the capacity, timeline, and cost associated with doing that?
That's a good question, because
or have you guys measured it, I guess?
We haven't measured it. We've just looked into it, but say there are 300. Some of them are easy because you look at it, because our main priority would be, we wouldn't want to recommend removing something that negatively impacted health, life, or safety, which is sort of the point of zoning, right? So if it's something that says like your house has to be painted red, that would be pretty easy, and we could go through that. But many SLs, they say something like, you can't do this, it can't be above a certain height. And then we'd have to figure out, like, was that a health safety issue, or is it a just sort of a neighborhood preference issue? And that would require going basically back into the case file. And sometimes, there's minutes, there's a planning and zoning case, and you can go all the way back and you can figure it out. So, each one could be a 10-minute sort of recommendation, or maybe 1 or 2 hours. I think we haven't fully gotten through to that, but it would be a very cautious process, I think, because you really wouldn't want to just say, oh yeah, get rid of this one, no big deal. And then years down the line, people are like, oh, that was actually really important. It was serving a really important purpose. But in the preliminary investigation we've done, talking to the Geotechnical Advisory Commission, they said, we think the codes today would probably resolve most of the issues that these seem to worry about. And JC said nobody's ever asked them about SLs. So, but they also said, but you should check, right? They're geotechnical engineers. They're like, don't do anything crazy. We want to protect life safety first. And John, I do have that AO. It's AO 2024-22, and section 3 says section 1 and 2 of this ordinance shall only become effective after first recording an easement by document, but generally located such easement is dedicated for and intended to allow the future daylighting of Fish Creek. So they used it. The assembly created a section in the AO to create an easement.
Good. Can I follow up, Ariana?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, Daniel, on your points, like you said, there's a lot of R10 SLs, and that kind of shows a weakness in R10. Which, there's an important kind of one aspect of SLs, but in the times I've used them, I've been involved with it. They've been very, very context sensitive. So it's not something's wrong with, B3. It's just it's that location. We felt like most of that lot should retain residential, but you should have B3. Down through the road or whatever road it was. It was rezoned from R8 to R10, but there was a cap put on the number of units, and that would not have passed without that SL capping the number of units. So those are very site specific and not something that is related to zoning. So is there a tool that could achieve those goals if SLs went away?
Well, I guess, I mean, if you're getting to site specific where everything is site specific, then zoning sort of loses its effectiveness, right? Because zoning is really about general applicability and a general agreed upon set of rules. But if every single rezone becomes a negotiation, then there's no stability. There's almost no point in having zoning there. Or what you could just say is that, look, in R10, every single use is a conditional use. And then you have to go through the planning and zoning. That's the other thing, is all R10 lots are SL lots. If every lot in the zone is an SL, then you can just put that into the zone and say every single use in here has to be through a conditional use. Or if people are using SLs to permit things that really might not be appropriate, it would be appropriate to deny the rezone, and that's okay. It's okay to say, you know what, according to the plan and according to the zoning, this really isn't appropriate. And if people protest that, you say, well, then let's change the plan or the zoning, because then you maintain the integrity of the system. But if every single rezone or every case or every subdivision becomes that sort of negotiation, then there really is no point in having a zone. If what you end up with every single R10 could be totally different from the other R10, then there's really no more consistency in the R10. I mean, it's interesting. You look at the R1 zone and the R1A zone. They're almost identical except for lot size. And those are considered two distinct zones. But then you look at SLs, and you can look at 3/8 R10 SLs, and they could have many, many other things that are different. And so that really challenges the consistency of what's going on, because then it says, well, what does that R10 even mean? If it just means like that you have to go through the negotiation, then great. Then you could just put, these aren't permitted uses, that everything is a conditional use. And then you could achieve the exact same end. And then anybody getting R10 knows anytime you want to build something, you have to go through this conditional use process. And the Planning and Zoning Commission could make that decision, which is actually even easier than the assembly. I mean, it's a lower level, right? So it's not as intensive. But you could say, make a single family home a conditional use in R10. And then every time you want to do it, you have to apply for a conditional use permit. And you have all that exact same discretion that can go into it, but it's consistent, it's stable. And then everybody knows you're going to get what you want to get, rather than if you say, well, it could be an SL and they could change anything, right? Like there are R3s on the hillside that say you can only have a single family house, which R3, when most of us think of it, we're like, oh, that's a multifamily zone, or it allows some flexibility. And so then it's like, well, why is it even an R3? And some of that, it might be because of height, but that's like, we'd have to go way back to dig into it. So to me, it seems that, yeah, if the interest is having discretion over every single project, there are ways to do that. And you can do it through the use table. Or you can just further limit if the issue, just make the lot sizes bigger. If the problem is really an R10, then say, 10-acre minimum lot or whatever. But there are ways to do it to get maybe to the same endpoint with a clearer process, I think.
I think most are much more context specific. Well, most that I've been involved with. It sounds like kind of historically they were things like you described, the zoning, but they think of one on that one on the Clear Road, that and in code it says, well, SLs can be used when a rezone otherwise wouldn't match the comprehensive plan or neighborhood context or something. So it is fairly specific. This is when they would be used. So it's not something that, I mean, it could be something that would do the whole zone, but in my experience, it's just one lot, one rezone coming to us, and the specific context of it, where it is, what's around it, and so on. So it's like, by having this SL, we could have a consistent with the comp plan, suitable for the neighborhood, just in that one instance. And if we didn't have the SL, there would be no rezone. And that, to me, in those cases, would have been a negative, not as good a place to be. Better to give the rezone with that SL than to say no to the rezone. And so, if that's the case, think very context. One piece of property and a rezone. Is there a tool that lets you do that, or would you only answer, okay, I guess no rezone?
Well, it's tricky because you go too far that road and you end up doing spot zoning. And there are SLs where zoning was used specifically to provide a specific benefit to one property. And spot zoning, it's generally frowned upon because it's treating one property differently from another. And so, yeah, you go down that road of every single one is going to be different. it's just going to introduce a lot of complexity and a lot of variety. And that maybe that's a much bigger question that I couldn't answer. Is that a policy choice that people want? They want that sort of variety, or are they looking more for consistency and stability? And I don't know, but I can tell you from our perspective, and ultimately it'll be whatever the assembly thinks meets what they think are the needs in the community.
Yeah.
Just before we end, are there any other questions? Anybody have like a short question they want to squeeze in? Okay, great. I just want to respect Daniel's time. Thank you for being here. I am dropping in the chat a reminder, if you're interested in doing public testimony, because the Federation loves civic engagement, you can provide written testimony, and I provided a link for doing that, or AO 2024-99 is item 14B on the agenda. And we encourage all people to make their voice heard on all government matters because it's important. So if you have if you're interested in speaking up, that's your ways to do it. Daniel, I dropped Daniel's signature. He also dropped his email in the chat too. So if you have more questions, really encourage follow up. Daniel, anything you want to say before we wrap up?
No, thank you for having me. And yeah, sorry we came to last minute, but another group asked us to join, so we want to go to CC. So thank you, everyone. The public hearing is tomorrow. So
public hearing is tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time. Have a good night.
Thank you.